Alright, in part two of the cardiovascular system, we're going to take a look at initiating the start of how blood is going to be able to pump through the heart. Now, this is in terms of writing. We'll see it in an illustration here a little bit in a second. But when we're mapping out blood flow through the pathway of the heart, again, we start out our heart as separate out deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. On the right side of the heart, you're going to contain oxygenated blood, and we said that in the top chambers, the two on the top are the atriums. Their job is to receive blood from either the lungs or from the rest of the body. So we're going to start out where there's deoxygenated blood, or blood low in oxygen, is going to return to the right atrium. And that right atrium is going to be on the upper side of the right side of the heart, and as it's going to travel its way through, it's going to travel down through the AV valve on the right side, or atrioventricular, which is the tricuspid valve, and enters down into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to pump blood out the ventricle and into the pulmonary trunk, where it then is going to force its way to the lungs. So as it valves its way, forces its way through the pulmonary trunk and eventually to the pulmonary arteries, and those arteries carry blood that can get rid of the carbon dioxide to the lungs and pick up the oxygen. Now that oxygenated blood that was in the lungs is going to return back to the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. Now if you remember from part 1, we looked at the pulmonary veins and the pulmonary arteries. These guys right here are the only two that are swapped in terms of arteries carrying deoxygenated blood and a vein carrying oxygenated blood. Otherwise, all arteries are going to be carrying oxygenated blood and veins carrying deoxygenated blood. Now from there, after it reaches into the left atrium, it's going to travel down through the left AV valve, which is known as the mitral or bicuspid valve, and into the left ventricle. And the left ventricle, you remember the thickness of the left ventricle wall, it has to pump blood throughout the whole body, so it's going to pump blood and it's going to travel its way through the aortic valve and out the aorta through distribution throughout the entire body. So if I'm going to map it, here in this illustration you can kind of take a look at it, where we enter in from this inferior and superior vena cava into the right atrium. From there it travels down through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Notice the thickness of the myocardium here. When it pumps through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk, this big T, and it travels either to the right lung or to the left lung. Again, the only instance in which an artery is carrying deoxygenated blood. From there it's going to travel into the lungs. Notice the 1, 2, 3 lobes of the right lung and the 2 lobes of the left. It travels into the lungs, picks up the oxygenated blood, and travels back through the pulmonary veins. This is the only instance where, again, you see a vein in which it's carrying oxygenated blood into the left atrium. From the left atrium, it's going to then travel down through the left AV valve, which is a mitral or bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. Now, if you look at the thickness of the ventricle on the left side versus that of the right side, obviously it's much thicker on the left because it has to pump blood throughout the whole body versus just laterally to the lungs. So as it then pumps, the left ventricle pumps it through the aortic valve and eventually out the aorta, and it can either go up to the upper portion of the head through the subclavians or into the carotid artery, or down through the subabdominal aorta, the renal artery, through the femoral artery, or wherever it may be. Okay? Basically the same image there. Now, as I stated earlier in the part 1, I talked about that the heart itself is a muscle, and the muscle is made up of muscle tissue, and those tissues are made up of cells. Cells, in order to be able to do their daily functions, need oxygen and nutrients. So we need to be able to supply oxygenated blood to the heart, and then that blood, those cells that take the oxygen out, they get rid of the carbon dioxide. They have to be able to drain the carbon dioxide out of the heart, and they do that by these two different vessels: the coronary arteries, which feeds the heart oxygenated blood, and then the cardiac veins, which once the blood becomes deoxygenated, it's going to then travel back into the right atrium. So if we take a look at here, here's an example of a coronary artery, and just corresponding to that is the cardiac vein, which again is going to empty into the right atrium. And this is just showing you on the reverse side. So this is the posterior side of the heart, where you can actually see the pulmonary veins that are actually posterior. So when you look at this side, it looks like this. The right pulmonary vein would actually travel through the heart. It actually is on the posterior side. So the pulmonary vein travels posterior to the heart and enters into the left atrium. Alright, we'll look at some heart actions. Blood pressure is the force of blood against the inner walls of the arteries. So you might feel blood pressure every time you can actually feel it with your fingers. You're feeling what you're considered as the pulse. And the pulse is the number of times that your ventricles actually contract in the arteries. Now, when you go to the doctor, almost every time they're going to do a blood pressure reading, and what they're reading for is, again, the pressure of the force of blood against the inner walls of the artery And there are two different numbers that they're going to give you. And according to the Mayo Clinic, the averages that you're going to get is about 120 over 80. Now that 120 is referring to your ventricular systole or ventricular contraction. So when your ventricles are your contracted point, the highest pressure, to then that over the lowest pressure, your ventricular diastolic. Your diastolic is when your ventricles are relaxed, or at its lowest pressure. So when you pump up the blood pressure cuff, you squeeze it to the point where you don't hear anything with inside the pulse, and then you slowly reduce the pressure on the sphygmomanometer or the blood pressure cuff to a point in which you first start hearing the blood pressure, and that is your systolic pressure, your highest pressure, and then you reduce that to the point where you no longer hear it, and that be your diastolic pressure. And again, according to the Mayo Clinic, you want to see it about 120 over 80. Some of the heart sounds that you typically hear, heart sounds are due to the vibrations in the heart, due to the rapid movement of blood. You typically hear them as a lup-dub sound or lub-dub sound, either one. Those are the Korsakoff sounds. So you hear that dun-dun, dun-dun, dun-dun. Those are the Korsakoff sounds. The contractions of the atriums, which is where the ventricles are relaxed, so that's the first lub. And then right behind it is the dub, in which the ventricles are contracted. Alright, so working our way out of the heart sounds, the lup-dup sounds, we're going to take a look at some of the images here. Now, this might be a little bit difficult to see. I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. Oh, scroll down a little bit more. Where we were. Alright, so the biggest thing I want you to take a look at is this guy right here. We're talking about our ventricles contracting and relaxing. Oh, let's do this one more time. Sorry about that. But we have our QRS waves, or the typical ones that you see on like shows like Grey's Anatomy or ER, where you see these big vibrations of waves that are occurring. Those are done from ECGs, electrocardiograms, or EKGs, either one. Now, when you're looking at these ventricles relaxed versus our ventricles contracting, as soon as our ventricles are contracting is where you get that initial spike. And that's where the big reading, that systolic pressure is going to be taking place. And just before, they're going to see a little bit of a loop, and that little P wave is where the atriums, if you scroll up to the top, are going to contract and force blood down. And just after that ventricle or the atriums are contracted, the ventricles are going to contract right after that. So that's what dun dun. You hear that quick sound is going to occur. First one and then the second one. So it'll squeeze down and then squeeze back out of the body, in particular the heart. Alright, the last thing we're going to talk about in this cardiovascular system are the blood vessels. We've mentioned it multiple times already, but they're going to contain three primary things: the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. Arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart all the time. Capillaries are where you're going to see gas exchange being occurring, in that particular carbon dioxide and oxygen, and veins is where they're going to be returning to the heart. Now, what I've shown here, arteries are thick, veins are thin. The reasons arteries are thick, and you'll see an illustration here in a second, is because they have to withstand that much higher pressure. Now, diagram number 3 that you're going to be seeing on your exam is going to be dealing with these guys, the differences between an artery and a vein. Now, one really pretty neat thing that the veins do have are these little valves. Now, these valves are going to be like backflow valves, so as soon as blood is going to travel up from the bottom, as soon as you stop moving, the blood doesn't pool all the way down the bottom of your feet. Whereas the arteries are under such high pressure, they notice that thickness of the structure of the walls of the tunica media, the muscular layers, because they have to withstand that high pressure that's being pumped from the heart. These guys don't have a very thick tunica media because there's not a whole lot of pressure that's behind it. So if we look at differences between the lumens are just an open hole, much smaller lumen in comparison in an artery in comparison to that of a vein. Now, if we look at our structure of it, so if you think this is our aorta that's pumping blood out of the heart, it's going to work its way down into these arterioles, but the biggest thing, arterioles, is the connection point between the artery and the capillaries. At this section right in the middle, where you're seeing the different hues from reds to blues, is where you're getting the gas exchange. It's so small that in particular there should be red blood cells almost going single file line through them. And then as it's going to travel its way back into a venule, which again a connection point between capillaries and a vein, eventually to the vein where hopefully it's mostly deoxygenated blood, and then picked up carbon dioxide and is going to work its way back through the vena cavas to the right atrium, where it can then pump its way through at the heart and get to the lungs and do the whole thing again. But as I mentioned in one of the pictures above, veins have this really pretty cool thing called a valve. And these venous valves, what they're going to allow us to do is to be able to push blood back all the way up towards our heart. Now, for an example, if we're looking at the blood that we force from our aorta all the way down to the tips of our toes, now going through the capillaries you're looking at here, the single file line, there's not the same pressure built up that there was in the arteries. So how do I get blood that's pulling at the bottom of my feet back up? What I have to do is I have to move. So skeletal muscle is actually massaging these veins and working their way up. Now when you stop moving, blood is going to then fall back down, but if it only falls a small distance, which is why we have these valves, it's not a big deal. If those valves were not there, they would fall all the way down to the tips of our toes where we'd pool up again, and that'd be a very bad thing. So if you've been on long distance car rides before or long plane trips before, you know how it feels when your blood starts to pool in your feet, they start to fall asleep. That is all due to the fact that blood is pooling in a particular location. Now, the last thing we're going to see here is some of the things we get to look forward to as we start to get older. We're going to start to see depositing some cholesterol in blood vessels. In particular, ones we have to be aware of are the coronary arteries. We don't want them a lot there, but unfortunately we do. And when that does happen, you run the risk of myocardial infarction or clotting that occurs inside those coronary arteries, which leads to a heart attack. We can see heart enlargements, cardiac muscles start to die off, fibrous connective tissue of the heart starts to increase, fat starts to increase on the heart, blood pressure is going to increase, it's got to work harder, especially because if cholesterol is being put in there, the heart's getting heavier, and your resting heart rate may decrease. Some arrhythmias or abnormalities that you might have within the heart, ventricular fibrillation is just basically going berserk. There's no electrical really impulse whatsoever, so in that sense we need to shock the heart and hopefully stop it dead, and then hopefully our hypothalamus medulla oblongata will then kickstart electrical impulse again. The rapid heartbeat is known as tachycardia. We are beating, yes, we said that if our average heart rate, you could try to get a heart rate over 120 to really start burning calories, but you get up to the 130, 140 range, you're having way too many heartbeats per minute. And then we get down to the atrial flutter, where we're getting a rapid rate of the atriums, and so the atriums, here's our ventricles contracting, but the atriums are continually contracting, so it's fluttering like crazy and not really getting the blood flow all the way through. That concludes the lesson on the cardiovascular system. Stay tuned for the next system on blood. Thank you.